Now you live in another world of your own. Now you look like another girl. You always wanted to be alone. Wipe the smile off your face, leave behind the human race.
Welcome to Sarandipity Vintage Library. Today we're doing something a little different. We all know the classic science fiction stories published in magazines like Amazing Stories, but what did readers think of them when they first appeared? These letters, discussions and editorials take us straight back to the late 1920s, when science fiction was a brand new literary movement. Readers argued passionately about H.G. Wells, as in this case, a 1927 issue of Amazing Stories. Edgar Rice Burroughs' scientific accuracy, impossible inventions, and the future of the genre itself. They weren't writing history, they were making it. So, we can step back almost a century and listen to the voices of the readers who helped shape modern science fiction. The June issue of Amazing Stories. Editor, Amazing Stories. Let me express my appreciation of the June number of Amazing Stories. I have too much to say to enclose it in the voting coupon. In regard to the prize stories, I wish to say that I believe the judges' choice to be perfectly in line with my own preference. All three were very good stories. I myself was a candidate for the prizes, and I can well appreciate the fine work which was done. I have one criticism for Mr. Waite's story. Frankly, I consider such a thing as a substance opaque to gravity impossible. When one considers the matter closely, it becomes utterly preposterous. Obviously, a material substance could not be opaque to gravity. The very fact that it is a material substance makes it susceptible and not impervious to gravity. That is the very essence of gravity. All matter is attracted to all other matter, and where there is anything, there is gravity. I can conceive of a screen of some sort of ray or ethereal wave through which the action of gravitation cannot function. But a material substance, never. And furthermore, above a screen opaque to gravity, no matter what it was constituted, a man could never assume an attitude of suspension. Once gravitation is removed, he would go flying off into space, never to return, thrust there by centrifugal force. However, this does not detract from the interest of that story. And there is another matter of gravity in the electronic wall. I hardly believe that a ship, even the size of the Woodrow Wilson, would have sufficient gravitational attraction to enable a man to walk comfortably about it. On the other hand, assuming Apollo to be a solid body, the attraction of this body would far overcome the gravity of the ship unless the electronic wall is opaque to gravitation. In this case, however, the passengers would find themselves in the unpleasant situation of being unable to stay on the ship comfortably, weighing naturally only a few grains or less. I was unable to find any scientific error in the third story, perhaps because it contains less science than the others. The Lost Comet was very good. Solander's radio tomb, however, has only a very faint hint of scientific taint, and I believe that it has no place in your magazine. To cap the climax, I do not believe that the author intended to put the slightest bit of science into it, other than that necessary to make it comprehensive. Ellis Parker Butler is a fine humorist and writer, but he has no connection with amazing stories. The four-dimensional roller press was a very interesting manuscript, although I fail to see what the age of the inventor had to do with the story. And although I understand practically nothing of the fourth dimension, I have always considered it to be time, and even if it were not, it is clearly a non-material dimension. This being the case, will you kindly explain to me how this fourth dimensional substance which Seidelberg produced inside his quaint arrangement of spheres could possibly have a material existence? If the creation of such a substance were possible by a mere mechanical arrangement of spheres, how could a material substance come instantaneously into existence where nothing before existed? And if it were not a material substance, obviously it would not be perceptible to the touch as it was set forth to be in the story. The Moon Pool is without question the best story you have yet published. It is written in the style of Edgar Rice Burroughs, although it contains far more science than the novels of the latter. The Tarzan stories, however, all of which I have read with intense interest, would be fine lessons for those hypocritical legislators who passed anti-evolution bills in Tennessee and Florida. The Moon Pool contains a staggering amount of imagination. In fact, there is so much that I had to reread the first installment before I could begin the second. It seemed so like a new story, always referring to points I did not remember ever having seen before. One thing which it brings out is the true significance of things that we see every day. In regard to the weapons, Mr. Merritt brings out the fact that the revolver is really more effectual than the Keth. Yet, hearing of the Keth, we would immediately denounce the revolver, and the gravity nullifying sparks are equaled by modern high explosives. And is not poison gas unexcelled by any of the weird implements of Muriel? We are not as bad off as we are wont to presume. And I kept looking forward to the appearance of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. I have always wanted to read this, but for some reason never have. Thanking you very kindly for the best issue of Amazing Stories ever published. I am Earl B. Brown, Massachusetts. In Paradise Lost, we are told of the bad angels who, in their discussions, found no end in wandering mazes lost. If we discuss the nullification of gravity and the fourth dimension and the possibilities of the beautiful story of the Moon Pool, we will get into the predicament of Milton's characters. Yet you evidently agree with the judgment of the editors that these have been very good stories, and we feel that when that can be said of the result of our efforts, we have done well. After all, we wish to please our readers, and our correspondent is certainly one of the pleased ones. Editor. H.G. Wells under fire, but also a lot of constructive criticism. To the editor, Amazing Stories. After finishing reading this letter, the reader of it may be inclined to ask me why I read Amazing Stories. My answer would be because I like it. I have read every story in every issue of Amazing Stories since the first issue and have no intention of missing any in the future. And I am not a magazine reader. Amazing Stories is the only magazine I ever did read, and right now is the only one I have any intention in reading at all regularly. I'm telling you this first because I'm going to give you a few of my ideas in the way of constructive criticism, some of which perhaps will not be very favorable. I wrote you once before and gave you some of the same ideas, and now I'm going to do it again. I might remark also that if I did not like amazing stories, I would not bother about writing you and giving you any of my time. I never did it for any other magazine, and I never will until something else as good in general as your magazine comes out. Your motto is extravagant fiction today, cold fact tomorrow. An excellent and undoubtedly true motto, but sometimes I find your magazine does not stay with it. Every true scientist admits that anything which is intrinsically possible, no matter how wild and extravagant it may seem, may be cold fact someday. But the scientist, at the same time, also admits that nothing can ever be fact, which of itself is impossible. A square circle can never be made. The definition of a scientific fiction story could be thus stated: a story which depicts the intrinsically possible but not as actually existent. It is obvious that a story which depicts the intrinsically impossible as actually existent is an effrontery to the intelligence, for the reason that the human intelligence is so constructed that it refuses to function in the presence of known falsehood. Some things are evidently intrinsically impossible, as the square circle, but others are not so evident, but at the same time just as impossible. For instance, the situation in the story about the lost continent of Atlantis, which I will take up presently. You should carefully guard against allowing such stories to get into your magazine, because they refute your motto, and I have noted quite a number of such instances in various ones. Now for a few of my objections. As I say above, you sometimes print poor science in that you allow authors to depict intrinsically impossible situations. In the story about the lost continent, the passengers on the ship view the inhabitants of the lost continent going far into the past to do so, and the inhabitants look up at the ship, an intrinsic impossibility. The passengers were viewing that which had taken place, much as an audience in a picture show views what the actors did when the picture was being taken. An action which has been completed can no more be changed than can a circle be squared. When the inhabitants lived, the ship was not there, and so they did not look up at it. Therefore, the author has made his characters do something which had already been completed over again and in another way. That story had no business in your magazine. It was entertaining, it is true, but that makes no difference. It has no place in a scientific fiction magazine, as it is merely fiction, not science. My really most serious objection to your stories in general is the lack of imaginative nerve of so many of the authors. There is entirely too much ruthless slaughtering of innocent heroes and heroines, and entirely too much blowing up and losing of valuable new inventions. The authors get to the end of their imaginations and take the easiest way out. They do not seem to realize that most readers of this class of story are imaginatively inclined themselves, or they would read something else. And being so, the reader can get just as much, if not more, enjoyment out of continuing the story in his own imagination as he did out of the story itself. And this useless slaughter and unnecessary explosions eliminate this pleasure to the reader. A rare instance of where the author has allowed this privilege to his readers is in the Mastermind of Mars, in your annual Neither Vala Dia nor Paxton were unceremoniously removed at the end of the story, as so many great heroes and heroines are, but are allowed to remain happily wedded on Mars. The reader is permitted by the author to change his own name to Paxton and have a grand time carrying on in his own elevation through deeds of prowess to the lordship of Mars. And the beautiful results of Vala Dia's rise with him to be the Queen of Mars, or any other flight of the imagination to which the turn of mind of the particular reader may direct him. The Mastermind of Mars is well on in its sequel in my imagination, and I'm having as much pleasure out of my own sequel as I did out of the story itself. A Columbus of Space offered the same, if not even better, possibilities for the reader's imagination. But the author would have none of it, finding it necessary in the temerity of his own imagination to dispose of his wonderful hero and heroine by letting them get caught in nothing but a common fire, when they had already escaped many more dangerous situations, thereby denying the reader the enjoyment of imagining his own sequel. That author simply lost his nerve. The same way, why always blow up wonderful new inventions after barely allowing the inventor to show what he has? Why not let the reader continue with it if the author does not want to go on with it? Lots of readers could have a wonderful time using some of the inventions in the world of their own imaginations. Just consider the man who could vanish. I have certainly had a great time in the world of my imagination vanishing, but darn the objector in that story. He had no sense of humor. I have ridden into town many a time in my car, the car being apparently without a driver. I have paid for my gas with money appearing out of thin air. I have been a marvelous magician. I have used it in games such as football, throwing an invisible pass into the waiting arms of an end down between my own goal posts. Gosh, but Doc Unsen was a nut to let the thing alone, and his friend needed a good swift kick. He was just an old grouch. For the Lord's sake, let the heroes and heroines live in the end and be happy. They have a hard enough life so that they deserve happiness in the end. And let the inventions go on in the world of the imagination. It cannot hurt anyone other than the possible overworking of the imagination of the author, and it may give great pleasure to those able to build their own sequels. Another of my objections is that so many of the stories are strung out, apparently with the only purpose of making them long. The War of the Worlds is a good one in point. The first installment was good, but the second in this month's issue was awfully dry. The experiences of my brother could just as well have been told in one paragraph, including the exodus of the people. The reader of the story did not give two whoops about my brother or the exodus of the people other than just the fact that they lit out. What the reader wanted to know was what were the Martians like and what were they doing. Had the story been but the first installment plus about 3 pages, it would have been fairly good, but as it is, it got to be an awful bore. While I am on this story, just a few of my impressions while I was reading it. Mr. Wells certainly commands a punk army. His cannoneers could not hit the broadside of a barn. His guns were efficient enough to be effective, for one did accidentally hit a Martian and knock him out, but at very close range. The Martians fought in 100-foot towers, and Mr. Wells' gunners got a great number of shots at them, mostly from a range of about 1,000 yards. Gosh, give an American gun crew one good 6-inch gun, and the chances that Mr. Wells' army had, and they could clean out the Martians in short order. Men in this story are certainly depleted as a lot of ignoramuses and ought to be wiped out. What were the men doing with the 9 spheres after the first one lit and men found out what was in them? Why did they not blow them up? Mr. Wells does not relate that the first ones protected the second and later arrivals. How greatly would it have improved the story if, in the end, men had figured out the Martians' susceptibility to disease and fed them the germs instead of just letting them acquire them naturally? The men would have won a great battle against great odds, while, as it was, they just got off lucky without using any inventiveness or human intelligence. I would certainly hate to think that the United States Army would light out and be incapable of fighting no more formidable foe than as Mr. Wells depicts the Martians. Mr. Wells certainly drew on his imagination when he conscripted his army, not constructively but just the opposite. His army was not half as good as armies which actually exist right now. Let Mr. Wells' Martians appear in this country today, and how long would they last? Gosh, let men, in our imagination at least, have as much intelligence and ingenuity as they have in actuality. What's the use of imagining if we are going to go the other way? They are welcome. There are things I do not like about it, stories which I do not like, but you cannot be expected to please everyone. In my opinion, you sometimes allow poor science to creep in. You print dry, uninteresting stories sometimes. Your authors often are not courageous imaginers and rob us of the pleasures of our own sequels. They kill the heroes, destroy forever wonderful inventions, many other faults. But the fact remains that I read your magazine religiously, and I often feel that I could write a really good story for the magazine. But then I read the discussions and realize that if I were to try it, it would have the fate of others. Some would like it and some would not. I have no doubt that many of your readers think the same of themselves. They would write the way their turn of mind directs, and I mine, while it is your task to please everyone. And this, in my opinion, you are doing admirably. A.M. Riordan, Arizona. And the editor answers, this we regard as a most interesting letter, as the writer certainly gives truly constructive criticism, which we are always delighted to receive, and puts it into very picturesque language. The stories must be interesting, and even if something that seems impossible is described, the author has at least the excuse, and an old-time one it is now, that the impossible has over and over again proved to be possible. The Einstein theory is now widely accepted, and if by following it out the Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction is taken as possible, a lot of the most curious conclusions will follow. We firmly believe that if before the Einstein theory was promulgated, a story had been written including all its features, bringing them down to the concrete, making full use of the fourth dimension as a reading topic, it would have been pronounced by most readers quite preposterous. We enjoy writing comments on our correspondence letters, but this one is so good and suggestive that it speaks for itself. However, we must refer to one of its suggestions. We are asked to publish occasionally a letter which candidly and openly gives your magazine a royal razz. This we have done in the past and shall continue to do so in the future. These unfavorable letters or brickbats, as they are sometimes called, will, we are sure, reach us in abundance, and we will publish them. In this issue will be seen the totally opposite views entertained by our readers on identical stories such as The Color Out of Space, and strangely enough about the writings of H.G. Wells, one of the most esteemed authors of the present day. H.G. Wells and his stories. To the editor of Amazing Stories. No need to say, I suppose, that I am an interested reader of your excellent publications, Amazing Stories, and I have been since the first copy appeared on the stands. A number of times I've been on the verge of taking advantage of your published invitation to make myself heard in regard to my opinions of stories you've printed. However, I've always come to the decision to keep still and let others do the talking. I've enjoyed most of the yarns Amazing Stories has given the public so far. I'll frankly say the majority of them have been well told by the different authors, and with the exception of a single one, The Malignant Entity. They've all been new to me. I'm not of a scientific turn of mind or even of mechanical inclination, but I believe that, like the majority of us, I too have my share of imagination. I appreciate a good story, well told, and that's that. I haven't so far attached myself to any one author who writes for Amazing Stories that has made a favorite of him. Most of them seem to be good. However, I am beginning to tire of one of them. That particular one is H.G. Wells. I've seen only one story by this author which has been able to hold my interest, The Time Machine. The rest of the stuff he has given us has been, I believe, but mediocre reading. There is no snap, no life to his stories. Take, for instance, that last story of his you've given us, The War of the Worlds. Honestly, this is the rankest, poorest would-be yarn I've ever laid eyes on. What's it all about anyway? What's he trying to tell and why? He uses a multitude of meaningless words and phrases, brewing out of them the sleepiest sort of quatch, and gets nowhere. How does a writer rated as high as you rate Mr. Wells get that way anyhow? I don't mean to do Mr. Wells any sort of injustice with a criticism like this, but I surely do agree with Mr. Fred W. Fisher Jr. of Knoxville, Tennessee, in saying that this particular story, The War of the Worlds, is rotten. And I agree with him as to the reason why it's rotten. To wit, he is always having one of his characters come out of his story to scratch his chin or tug his whiskers or expectorate or something. And all of his tales are generally disconnected. I'll say they are, Mr. Editor and also Mr. Fisher. He gives one the impression of an amateur trying to raise a tempest in a teapot. In other words, much ado about nothing. I read this story through after seeing Mr. Fisher's criticism under discussions of the August issue, and your defense of Mr. Wells, and I second Mr. Fisher's request not to reprint H.G. Wells' stories unless he comes across with something worthwhile. In my opinion, The War of the Worlds can easily be boiled down to 2 or 3, at the most 4 pages, for all the science or fiction it contains, because the rest of it is just plain waste of space. I want to say in conclusion that Jules Verne's Off on a Comet was very good. Here's a writer who, no matter how he draws out his story, still is able to hold one's interest and attention. And I'm not saying this because I'm unduly prejudiced against Mr. Wells and favor Verne in particular. Station X was good. The Second Deluge, The Lost World, A Columbus of Space, The Moon Pool, The Mastermind of Mars, and some others I can't recall certainly were masterpieces. Give us more stories like these. They are not only interesting as fiction, but the science they contain is equally digestible. I'd like to see amazing stories twice a month, but certainly not if you can't give us anything better than The War of the Worlds. Illustrations by Paul are very good, but don't crowd out any interesting reading matter for the sake of a few sketches. Wishing amazing stories a long and prosperous life. S. Francis, Chicago. The editor says, the work of the distinguished author H.G. Wells fails to impress some of our readers. The curious feature of Mr. Wells' work is that it has an enormous acceptance by the reading public, and so high is the degree of approval awarded him that we feel that his very name carries weight. One can criticize Paradise Lost. There is a fault in prosody in the first line, but John Milton shows in his epic the veritable glories of the English language, so do not be too hard on Mr. Wells. About some of our authors. Editor, Amazing Stories. Having been one of your constant readers from the first issue, I'll take the liberty to write you a few of my ideas regarding your good magazine. I am a lover of good science fiction. I especially like interplanetary stories of all the different worlds and distant universes. I would be glad for you to give us more of these kind of stories. And while on this subject, let me ask you, why don't you publish some of the stories written by Homer Ian Flint? I have read several of his planetary stories, and all of them I enjoyed reading. I remember in particular one of his stories that I liked very much, The Planeteer. This story was published several years ago in another magazine, in Argosy, or All Story magazine, about 1917 or 1918. I would enjoy reading this story again, and also some of his other stories. Can you print this story and any of his others? Of the stories you have printed, some of my favorite authors are A. Merritt, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Garrett P. Serviss, and a few by H.G. Wells. The trouble with Wells and some of his stories is he uses too many words in describing a situation, and it becomes tiresome. However, some of his stories are very good, and his science is usually good. I consider Station X one of your best stories. And as for your comedy stories, I consider your magazine is no place for them. None of them are interesting, and I think most of your readers will agree with me. It will please me if you will leave them out of your magazine entirely. And I have a suggestion to make you and Mr. A. Merritt. You have stated that Mr. Merritt will give us a sequel to his story, The Face in the Abyss. Why can't he combine this sequel with another of his stories, The Moon Pool? That was an excellent story and deserves a sequel. Mr. Merritt could easily put the characters of these two stories together into one real good sequel covering both stories. Both stories are somewhat similar in their texture, science, and general settings. Will you take this up with Mr. Merritt? With best wishes for the success of your magazine, and hoping to see this letter printed in your next issue, and with your answers to my above questions. Charles Knight, Little Rock, Arc. We are sure that this letter will be read by our authors with much interest, and we will take pleasure in taking up your suggestion with Mr. Merritt, the editor. Climate and remote geologic ages. The morality of the Martians. To the editor, Amazing Stories. In the first place, I wish to say how much pleasure I derive from reading Amazing Stories. You could not have chosen a better title for amazing they are. Some of them I read, but others, like The Land That Time Forgot, is a great strain on the imagination, for I should say it was an utter impossibility for types of fauna and flora of Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic to be living at the same time. I should say that atmospheric conditions of the Mesozoic period was unfit for life of the Cenozoic to exist in. Life of the Pliocene time to be in existence with the Jurassic doesn't sound feasible. Again, as regards the astronomical writers, why do they always give poor little Mars such a bad time? Simply because the planet is reddish in tint doesn't necessarily mean it is of a sanguinary disposition, which all fiction in regard to it seems to suggest. The presumption is that being a much older planet than the Earth, it is by thousands of years more civilized. If life exists at all, take Edgar Rice Burroughs' latest brainwave, Mastermind of Mars, and all his other yarns about Mars. It is nothing but battle, murder, and sudden deaths, besides having the most grotesque forms of life imaginable. There are men of purple, green, yellow, and every color of the spectrum, dressed like Roman warriors, with short swords, and ye gods, radium guns. Can you beat it? And again, consider the man who saved the earth. Once more, poor little Mars. She tried to drain the Atlantic Ocean. Then we have H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. This is an old story, but it is good fiction, but at the same time, highly improbable. I think Mars is a very, very much maligned planet. If there is a form of high intelligence on Mars, I don't suppose for one moment it bears the slightest resemblance to man. Mars, being many millions of years in advance of the Earth, has presumably passed beyond the man stage of existence. Just as certainly as man will pass from Earth to give place to an infinitely higher form of life, and a beautiful form at that, and not a monstrosity like H.G. Wells would have us believe. In the law of evolution, nature never retrogrades, always advances. It may possibly appear to retreat at times, but it is for a purpose. She re-advances with renewed energy. I hope this letter has not bored you, Mr. Editor, for I am earnest in my humble efforts, and I certainly do believe in an almighty intelligence which stands supreme. This is my faith and my knowledge. Life is continuous and indestructible. R.L. Morris, Toronto. The editor answers, it is not safe to differentiate the climates of geologic eras too definitely. Undoubtedly, in the Carboniferous era, conditions were very favorable to vegetable growth, but there was much animal life then, and it seems to be going too far to affirm that it was climate alone that controlled and governed the fauna and flora of past epochs in the world's history. We find man living in various climates on the present sphere. The difference between the climate of the Arctic zone and of the temperate zone, and still more of the torrid zone, is extremely great. Yet man lives in all of them. On the coast of Peru, the natives are more frightened of a rainstorm, which occurs perhaps once in several years, than they are at an earthquake, which visitations are extremely frequent there. So, man at least could have endured the climatic conditions of pretty nearly any of the ages you mentioned. It is hard to say why Mars is picked upon. We say that nature never retrogrades. Is it not fair to say that humanity, devoting the highest science to the development of lethal gases for the next world war and devising other methods of destroying human life, preparing for war times of peace, has been forced to take a retrogressive step? A very short and sharp criticism of H.G. Wells. To the editor, Amazing Stories. While reading the August number of Amazing Stories, I became interested in H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. I learned that a shot from a cannon was capable of putting a Martian war machine out of commission. And as later it was found that it was impossible to use cannons, why didn't they send out airplanes? Immediately after learning this fact, I lost all interest in the story. S. Kaufman, New York. The editor writes, "We suppose that the above letter may be considered a sort of metaphorical shot from a cannon to knock a very distinguished author from the pedestal on which thousands of admirers have placed him. He may fairly be termed a present-day classic. A curious movement in Florida. Amazing Stories is a monthly." To the editor, find the enclosed clipping from one of the newspapers. To put it slangily, they are all wet. I refer generally to the opposition to H.G. Wells. I think some of his stories are the best that I have ever read. I hope you continue inserting at least one in every issue. I have procured your annual and was very well pleased with it. I think such a book as that should be published every 6 months. I, for one, would surely be eager to get it. I especially like The Mastermind of Mars. Among the stories that I like best since I have been getting amazing stories are the following: The Moon Pool, The Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, The Green Splotches, The Star of Dead Love. I hope you put more of Mr. Merritt's work in the coming issues. Mr. Merritt deserves a merit for this story. It was one of the best that you have published. When I bought my annual, I also asked for amazing stories for September, and they said that you didn't publish one for September, but that the annual came out in its place. I think there must be a mistake, isn't there? I get so interested in the War of the Worlds and then found that I had such a long wait until the second installment. I am 16 years old and have been taking amazing stories for about 9 months. I'm sorry I missed the first issues. I wish much success to Amazing Stories for the future. H.G. Wells, Freud Assailed in Florida. Talashi, August 10. Freud, George Bernard Shaw, and H.G. Wells were among the authors included in a list of indecent, immoral, and filthy text and reference books and many rotten fiction books which a group of deacons of the First Baptist Church here told Governor John W. Martin are in use in the libraries of Florida's higher institutions of learning. The deacons, upon suggestion of Governor Martin, will submit a written report in the State Board of Education at its weekly meeting next Tuesday. Lester Soderman, Toledo, Ohio. The clipping which our correspondent has sent us and which we take pleasure in publishing is certainly interesting. The state of Florida cannot undertake to run the universe from the standpoint of literature. Amazing Stories comes out every month. Your news dealer was in error. If you did not get your September number, we will be glad to supply you. Our October issue. To the editor, Amazing Stories. I want to tell you my impressions of the October issue of Amazing Stories. Ray Cummings' story Around the Universe was delightful, and but for one thing would be great. I mean, the feeling the reader gets that the author is laughing at him. Satire is different. It is laughing at everyone but yourself. But somehow Mr. Cummings gives me the atmosphere of ridiculing me on every page. You know, a reader is a selfish animal. The author must please him. It is a vague point though, and the story was good. Incidentally, more of the same type will be welcome. Wells is always the master. I get tired eulogizing him every month. The Winged Doom was great, gigantic, thrilling, again, except for one thing. The atmosphere is nothing more than a reproduction of anti-German propaganda during the war. A scientific story, to be scientific, must be universal. Mr. Gilbert has done the same thing Burroughs did in The Land That Time Forgot, and Merritt in The Moon Pool. I wish your authors would cut that out the Germans, or Mr. Gilbert's unnamed future enemy that resembles the Germans as so much, are human beings. Garrett Smith easily takes his place with Burroughs for interest and is less fantastic. The story so far is good. There seems to be some attraction to you, Mr. Editor, in a foreign story. In the last issue, you had The Malignant Flower by Anthers from Germany, poorly written and an idea too much used. Now you have The Paradise of the Ice Wilderness from Norway, which is only better written. You know, I see great store by two things, style and atmosphere. Your editorial was interesting, but I take it with a grain of salt. And that I believe a person must have a wide reading and must have thought of scientific and philosophic subjects on his own account in order to understand and appreciate and be safe from harming himself scientifically. Do you get me? To be frank, there is harm in your magazine to one who has not the qualifications set out above. Science is not everything, and the future is not everything. G.K. Chesterton sets this forth much better than I can in What's Wrong with the World. I'm not going to quit reading amazing stories just the same. Abraham Siegel, Philadelphia. The editor writes, an editor is always delighted when he is made the target for a well-directed brickbat. You will not harm yourself by reading the stories we publish, nor we believe will any of our other readers. Everything published by us in fiction is fiction, but there is science galore in our pages, and our magazine will be found to give you a vast amount of scientific instruction. Your letter is thoroughly appreciated, therefore, as an enlightened criticism should always be, whether we agree with the writer or not. We are glad you like the paradoxical Chesterton. We are sure you will never stop reading amazing stories. So for this issue, we come to the end of discussions, and do let me know if you'd like more of this kind of stuff. Thank you for listening, and do subscribe and like.